Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the Rome in America podcast. Before we get into it, make sure to hit the like button and hit the subscribe button. That would really help me out a lot. I would really appreciate that. So, yeah, like and subscribe, make sure. So, yeah, thanks anyways. So, all right, let's get into it. So, been about a week since I did my last episode, and in that week, a lot has happened, and the big story that I want to go with today is the alleged, we don't know for sure yet, hopefully it'll stick, but the alleged end to the Iran war. So, as we all know, for 3.5 months, this war in Iran has been going on, in which basically it's been mainly an air war with, missiles and drones being shot back and forth between Israel, and Iran, and also Iran shooting at American military bases in the Gulf states and all that stuff. And then also the blockades of the Strait of Hormuz, which has affected global oil prices significantly, which, have decreased a little bit over the past week or so, but we're at they were at quite a lot just a few weeks ago, maybe a month ago, whatever you want to say. So, I guess what I want to talk about is the inside scoop of what is going to happen with the end of this war, how this war is going to end, if it's going to end, will it pick back up for round 3 at some point in the future, will all that happen? Basically what happened was earlier this week, the U.S. and Iran signed what was called an MOU, which essentially was a de facto ceasefire in the conflict. So the MOU stands for a Memorandum of Understanding, which basically is almost like a deal to start negotiations, almost to an even bigger deal. So, it's not a peace deal necessarily, but it's a ceasefire that can be a pathway to a peace deal of some kind. And basically in the deal, it would be a 60-day ceasefire. The Strait of Hormuz would be reopened. And here's what the deal is. Yes, the Strait of Hormuz gets reopened. Iran, however, gets to maintain a ballistic missile program. They supposedly would get to, at bare minimum, would get to keep their nuclear program, although there's still disputes about the removal of the, so-called nuclear dust and enriched uranium-235, which, is still, I guess, a point of contention and all that stuff. But there's a lot of stuff going on, and I guess at the end, when you even out all of the points within the deal, you can only conclude that this was an Iranian victory, because a lot of stuff, Iran was able to, if not have 100% control, they at least have increased their control and influence over the Strait of Hormuz, not just throughout this past war, but now it's going to be like that permanently, it appears. They got to keep their ballistic missile program. While there's still negotiations, it seems that at bare minimum, they will keep their nuclear program. And if they're allowed to enrich any uranium at all in their centrifuges, it will be at a bare minimum, low, very, very low percentage. And then, their drone program and stuff like that. And point is, and also the regime itself, by the way, although the supreme leader was killed on the very first day of this war, the regime itself is still the same. Still a lot of the same military commanders, same president. The new supreme leader of the country is the former supreme leader's son. And so really the regime is still the same. And so regime change ultimately failed. And, the Strait of Hormuz, blockaded, whatever you want to say. Point is, Iran started off by closing the Strait of Hormuz, and it had an impact. And we saw that impact over these last few months. And really what I guess is, really what I guess is the sticking point about this war and about this, so-called peace deal, this MOU, is will it last? And one of the main points of contention that seems to be, a wrench thrown into our plans is Israel's war in Lebanon. That seems to be one of almost, from the Iranian perspective, that seems to be one of their prerequisites to having this war come to an end, ultimately, is because literally 2 days after this war started against the Iranians, Hezbollah began launching drones into northern Israel. And then when that happened, Israel began launching its ground invasion into Lebanon again, ultimately. And basically, Israel is now occupying a large portion of southern Lebanon, basically every portion of the border and all that stuff. And, although there have been, de facto, or de jure, I guess you could say, although there have been de jure ceasefires signed on paper, the Israeli armies continued advancing up north into the rest of Lebanon. And, there was even a few soldiers who crossed north of the Litani River. And so, not just Lebanon, but also Israel launched their invasion from the southeast portion of the border, from the Golan Heights, which, as we all know, although the Golan Heights is Israel occupied, it's still internationally recognized as part of Syria. And so, Israel's been doing that. And we haven't heard much about Syria, but there have been calls from the Israeli government to have Syria take a greater role in neutralizing and being combative against Hezbollah. Because, of course, there's a new regime, obviously, in Syria, has been for the past year and a half, which, does not support Hezbollah the way that the old regime did. And so there have been talks about that, but nothing really too serious. And so that ultimately has been one of the main sticking points, is that, Israel's war in Lebanon could ultimately derail the peace talks if that war is not brought to an end, ultimately, and Israel does not withdraw its troops from southern Lebanon. And basically, and that war is, it's somewhat taking a toll on the Israelis, because Hezbollah has very cheap drones that they can launch at Israeli tanks and stuff like that, drones that they buy from the Iranians, obviously. And, well, ultimately, the Israelis have shown no sign of wanting to stop, and, even much almost to their own detriment, in terms of domestic affairs, because this October, I believe, Israel is expected to have new elections, and in those elections, they could elect a new prime minister. And right now, on the prediction markets, Benjamin Netanyahu has dropped into second place for who is most likely to become, or remain, whatever, be elected next prime minister of Israel in the elections in October. Now in first place is Naftali Bennett, who anyone who knows about the ins and outs of Israeli politics and their foreign policy and stuff like that will know that Naftali Bennett really is no different than Netanyahu. The only difference, and I guess the only silver lining you could say, is that Bennett is not as charismatic and as communicative as Netanyahu, because as we all know, when Netanyahu, every time he comes to the United States and gives a speech before Congress, he gets like 50 standing ovations in one speech, whereas other Israeli politicians, they just aren't capable of doing that, whether it be Naftali Bennett or Benny Gantz or Yair Lapid, whoever it is, whoever's been, in that role or in the opposition role, anyone who's not Netanyahu, essentially. And so really, at the end of the day, that's what's going on. And so really what we're hoping for is a ceasefire in Lebanon so that that war can get brought to an end, because that ultimately is what's going to affect whether or not the ceasefire with Iran is going to hold. And really, all this war has shown is that the American empire has reached its limits. I mean, assuming that the war would continue, I mean, really, you could say now, but even if the war were to continue, America's military bases in the Gulf states are rendered useless in terms of their designed purposes for like radar detection and launching drones and missiles and stuff like that. All of our bases in Saudi Arabia, in Qatar, in naval base in Bahrain, in our base in UAE, those are all pretty much finished. I mean, we cannot use those bases the same way we used them in the past. That era has been brought to an end. And so really all this is suggesting is, what's going to happen. And, there's some, and, honestly, I really don't think, in all honesty, I really do hope the ceasefire sticks, but I'm not too optimistic about it because a lot of the chief goals that Israel wanted to accomplish in the 12-day war did not get accomplished. And then guess what? They just kicked the can down the road, and months later, we ended up launching round 2. And so, honestly, the same thing could happen this time again. Again, I hope it doesn't, but the same thing could happen again. We could sign a ceasefire, this war could get brought to an end, and then months later, Netanyahu could once again convince Trump that, hey, we got to go back in. They're this close to getting a nuclear weapon, and they have missiles that can hit all across the planet, whatever. Basically, the same, Hasbara propaganda that Netanyahu sold to Trump in order to launch the previous 2 wars. And, I'm not sure how well it's going to work for round 3, but, anyone who knows Trump knows that he's the most pro-Israel president in American history. And so he's much more likely to just take Netanyahu's word at face value than be skeptical and stuff like that. And so I'm not really sure what's going to happen next. But, we got to have hope for the future. And we got to hope that, and honestly, and Trump is trying to spin this into a victory, this withdrawal, even though it is clearly a loss. But at this point, it's like, at this point, it's like, we got to learn to not care about that, because at the end of the day, Trump's going to be Trump. He's going to try to spin anything he can into a win in order to make himself look like a winner and look like a hero, and that's just how he is. And so really all we got to do is just say, fine, we'll take it. As long as it stops the fighting, we'll take it. And so, it appears Trump is trying to find a way out of it, but Netanyahu wants the war to continue. He wants against the Iranians. He would much prefer, if Netanyahu got his way, honestly, he would much prefer that the 82nd Airborne He would much prefer that the 82nd Airborne just parachute right into Tehran with His Royal Majesty Reza Pahlavi and reinstall the Shah's regime as part of their regime change, And it was something that was floated at the beginning of this war when protests erupted at the beginning of the war and all that stuff. Some of them against the Iranian regime, although some were in favor of it. But, yeah, that clearly isn't going to work, honestly. I mean, there's just no mandate from anybody for that guy to return to Iran and reclaim the throne and basically proclaim a new regime, or I guess the old regime before the revolution of 79. But basically, there's no support for him. I think his highest approval ratings for like getting him back in are like 10%. So he basically has no public support from the Iranians or the international community. I mean, he doesn't even try to visit the country or even visit a bordering country like Azerbaijan or Iraq or something like that. But basically, we're gonna I hope the ceasefire sticks, but knowing how Netanyahu operates, he basically will do everything he can to convince Trump to go back in for round 3. Basically, he will not stop until the regime that rules Iran is completely destroyed and their nuclear program, even though it's a civilian energy nuclear program, is also completely destroyed, and their ballistic missile program is completely destroyed, and they have zero leverage in order to keep Israel in check, because Israel, of course, wants territorial expansion. That's why they want to take down the Iranians, because they're the last pawn left on the chessboard that can get in their way. And they're slowly doing it right now, obviously. They're they're obviously conquering Palestine. They're still occupying roughly half of the Gaza Strip, even though there's been a, de jure ceasefire since last October. There's been still low levels of fighting, and they occupy half of the Strip, and they occupy much of southern Lebanon because they want to expand their borders northwards, and that's, of course, why, obviously, they occupy the Golan Heights in Syria, and why, when the Assad regime collapsed, they immediately invaded Syria to expand the buffer zone and take control over Mount Hermon, or Mount Hermon, I think it is, in the southwest part of the country, just west of Damascus and stuff like that. And so territorial expansion is definitely something that the Israelis have wanted forever. And yeah, honestly, the Iranians, unfortunately, I'm not an Islamist, so I don't want to be a defender of the Iranian regime, but they're the last ones that are standing in the way of, essentially, of Israel becoming a regional superpower and taking control over most of the Middle East. And so I guess the only thing we can do left is pray that they stop, that this war stops, that we can decouple from Israel. And that is something, by the way, that is seemed to have gotten on a lot of people's minds over this last war, is that we now even need to decouple arms sales from Israel, and all arms sales and all military aid of any kind from that country, because we're not getting the bang for our buck that we intended, and it's at the expense of American blood and treasure. And so we just hope, I guess, that this does lead to a radical political change within our country, where people in Congress, people on Capitol Hill decide, you know what, we can no longer support Israel because they're too much of a liability for us. Unfortunately, most of Congress seems to not have that view, and so, we got to hope that, over the next 5 to 10, maybe 20 years, we can get people into office that, will follow our mandate and will decide to put an end to this once and for all. But I guess to wrap it up, I hope that the ceasefire sticks. I hope that the Israelis withdraw finally. And I really hope that we can put this to bed. But knowing history and just knowing the people in that region, I know the fact that this isn't the end. Even if it's a brief pause in hostilities, it's not the end, because at the end of the day, people have their own political ends and objectives, and they will do anything to achieve it. So let's just hope for the best. That's all I can say about that. So thank you for sticking around for this video. Next video will come out next week, next episode, but thank you for sticking around for this episode. Make sure to hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. Thank you very much, and I will see you all in the next episode.